All right, welcome to this session of the Iowa Ideas Conference. I am your moderator, Aaron Murphy. I am the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette. We appreciate you all joining us for this session. And this session is on public lands, and we are within the policy track for this year's conference. Our time together today will include talking with our panelists and also addressing audience questions. So if you have any questions throughout our discussion, put those in the chat. And if we have time, we'll get to those. And I just wanted to remind you that all of our sessions have closed caption access and all of our sessions are being recorded. And before we get started, we also want to remind everybody that the Iowa Ideas 2023 conference is sponsored by ITC Midwest. So we thank them for their support. All right, so I'd like to now welcome in our panelists and have them tell a little bit about themselves and how their work is relevant to our discussion today, which again is on public lands, and we are within our conference's policy track. So we'll start here with Mike Webb. Mike is a volunteer with Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Hello, Mike. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Mike Webb, lived in Iowa for about 16 years now, born and bred in the Midwest. Came to my current position on Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, a conservation group, through some volunteer work. Helped stand up the chapter here in Iowa about 5 years ago. And we focus a lot on public access as well as public policy for public access and public lands. And looking forward to the conversation.
Very good. And we also have with us Mark Beltram, who is with the Beltram Law Firm. And Mark, tell us how you're tied to this topic.
Thanks, Aaron, and welcome everybody. So I've been in the public advocacy space for the past 18 years on behalf of Ducks Unlimited. I'm a life member of Ducks Unlimited and very committed to their public policy, which is the preservation of wetlands specifically and generally, protecting watersheds. Lifelong Iowan, and really excited to be a part of this discussion this morning.
Very good. Thank you. Also with us is Joe McGovern, who is with the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. Hello, Joe, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, Aaron, and good morning to everyone. Joe McGovern. I'm the president of Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. I've been president about 11 years. I've been with INHF now for 24 years. Our organization was created in 1979 by then Governor Ray, really with a specific purpose of helping our public partners acquire parks, trails, wildlife areas. They saw a need back in the late 70s that they weren't able to add some of these precious lands to the public use. And so that's why we were created. But since that time, we've also expanded our work into working with private landowners on conservation easements. We also help other nonprofits meet their conservation goals. And at the end of the day, we view ourselves as a partner. We work very closely with our public partners like the Fish Wildlife Service, the Iowa DNR, our county conservation boards, and then also partnering with private landowners.
All right, very good. And lastly, we have with us Dennis Gumate, who is with Lynn County Conservation. Hello, Dennis. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good morning. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I'm a lifelong Iowan, and as you can see from my gray hair, that's getting longer and longer all the time. So just love the state. Really enjoy being here and working on behalf of the natural resources in the state. So I'm the director of the Lynn County Conservation Department. Been director for about 6 years now, but have been with the department for 42 years. So I've been from a number of different angles with connecting people to the outdoors and to natural places. So we manage parks, natural areas, preserves, wildlife areas, and trails are becoming a bigger part of what we do all the time, and as well as river accesses. That we have great river systems in the state, so we're connecting people to those river systems as well.
All right, very good. So we thank you all for being with us today for what I know is going to be a great discussion. And again, want to remind folks who maybe just jumping on with us that first of all, we thank you for being here. And also we want this to be interactive to as much as possible. And so if you'd like to ask a question of any of our panelists, please put that in the chat. And we have some folks working behind the scenes here who will get those through. And if we get a chance, we'll get to those questions as well. So I wanted to start this discussion with sort of the genesis for this topic and why we're here today. This came up during this year's session of the Iowa legislature in the form of proposed legislation. And having covered that discussion, I know that the genesis for that proposal was that some farmers believe that it has become harder and harder to purchase land in Iowa because it is difficult for them to compete against other entities that purchase land for public use. So since that is one of the main reasons that this topic is relevant right now and why we're all here discussing it, I thought we should just address that right off the bat. And before we jump into the discussion, let me just give you a kind of a quick bit of background and data. The proposed legislation would have required the state to prioritize maintenance of current public lands over acquisition of new public lands. Now that bill did not pass, but what did ultimately pass was a measure that eliminated a goal for the state to have 10% of land be publicly owned. Now, it's worth noting that the state is nowhere near meeting that goal anyway. Right now, only 3% of Iowa's land is publicly owned, according to multiple estimates out there. And actually, only 3 states have lower shares of publicly owned land. So Iowa's low, comparatively speaking, to other states in the country. So that's what came out of the legislative session. Joe McGovern, president of the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, we'll start with you because I know you and your organization were engaged in that debate at the State House. So let me have you address this right off the top. In your view, is the process for purchasing land in Iowa unfair to farmers, and does the state own too much land?
There's a couple questions there. I would say, first of all, I do not believe that the process is unfair to any purchaser. When we purchase land on behalf of our partners, let's say the County Conservation Board, it's from willing sellers, and we're a willing buyer. So there is no other process. They have to be a willing seller. It's also based on fair market value. So we get a valuation of that property, what the fair market value would be. And that's really the number we're looking at. And then on the other end of the spectrum, that other question, do we have too much land? I'm not concerned about our ranking, whether we're 49th or 47th. That number really doesn't mean anything to us. What we're really talking about, do we have enough parks, trails, and wildlife areas in the state to meet the outdoor recreation needs of Iowans? And in addition to that, do we have enough land to attract workforce? Do people want to come when they find a job or they're looking for jobs? Is this a place they want to come work? So we really look at it as not that it's too much land or too little land. It's more, are we meeting the needs of Iowans for their outdoor recreation, but also, as you might hear, water quality, soil health, all those other issues. So I don't think we're there yet. And I don't think it's unfair. I will say there's tension. There's a lot of demand for land. So whether it's demand as agriculture, whether it's demand for development, whether that's residential or commercial, there's a lot of demand on land, and there's always going to be some tension whenever a property is purchased. There's always going to be maybe a different use that could have been. So I think really that's the heart of it, Aaron, is that we're dealing with a high demand for all land, and there is demand for recreation and public use in our parks or trails or wildlife areas, and that's really the tension we're seeing.
Very good. I appreciate that. And I did want to point out for those listening here, there were other groups involved in this debate in the State House this past session, as I noted, and we at the Gazette made an attempt to reach out to some of those to be involved in our discussion here today, and we're unable to do that for whatever reason, but did want folks to know that we had reached out and made that offer. Michael Webb, what's your kind of big picture view of this, given your experiences? How do Iowa farmers feel about being able to purchase land, and is there a concern that another concern I hear is, are we taking too much land out of production for other reasons?
Sure. Yeah, and I will say in my non-voluntary opportunities, I have opportunity to run into some farmers in different avenues, and on a one-on-one basis, I've not heard that expressed in really any personal conversation. It's been a lot larger at the policy level with, I would say, groups that are interested in that conversation and where it goes. And you mentioned a little bit at the beginning there about some of the proposed legislation around maintenance fees, and if you're going to turn something into a public access, the amount of maintenance fees that would be required to be held in trust to be able to support that land for X amount of years during that turnover. So I think just a lot of interest there, as Joe mentioned. So yeah, I don't believe that I guess I have not experienced a large held view that we're creating in any way an unfair opportunity one way or another for groups to acquire land. As Joe mentioned, I think everything I've been involved with has been fair market value, willing selling, willing buyer type opportunity. And then I think to the production conversation of, you mentioned 3% public land. If you do some rough math, about 36 million acres is the entirety of Iowa. That puts about 400,000 acres in public use right now, from parks, trails, recreation. So the remaining 35,600,000 acres is homes, development, and in production, or possibility for production. And I think looking at land and production of just the idea, I think production in that question comes into, are we raising corn on it? Are we raising soy on it? Are we cutting alfalfa off of it? Whatever the case may be. I think you have to look at the overall picture, a little bit of what Joe mentioned of, drawing people into the state, recreational opportunities, bringing people in. But not only that, like, what's the economic benefit of those recreational opportunities? I don't have the numbers at my fingertips right now, but the overall hunting industry and fishing industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry, and recreation as well across the U.S., there's a lot of economic benefit that comes from, in these rural areas, being able to have an opportunity out on public lands or private lands, whatever they may be, to recreate. You look at Iowa, one of the top deer hunting states in America. There's people that pay a pretty penny to come here and hunt, both on private and public land, and are bringing money to local communities. So, what's your definition of production? I think could be part of that conversation. And then the other piece of that too is just, how do we use that opportunity and what we have in this state to continue to grow it? I mean, if you look at the overall population in Iowa, has stayed fairly consistent for many, many years. You look at other states out west that have some of those opportunities. They've also got landscapes that differ from ours, but definitely access to those opportunities and landscapes plays a role in that.
Yeah, and that touches on, that's maybe a real good segue. Dennis Guma, I wanted to bring you in here. Why is it important that the state own at least some public land for public use? And you may be able to pick up on some of the things that Joe and Mike already said, but I wanted to get your perspective on why this is important to talk about in the first place.
You're right. So when I look at the agricultural community and the economy in Iowa, it's really important that we maintain that. We also have to look at other residents of the state. And I'll use myself as an example. I live on a quarter-acre lot in a town, and then when I want to recreate, I have to go somewhere to do that. Don't have a choice. I don't have a back 40. I don't have 100. I don't have 1,000 acres to go to. So I have to go to those areas. And I think there are far more people like that my situation than what we usually talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we meet their needs? How do we enhance their quality of life so that they do have places to recreate? And one of the things that we've really gotten into are making trail connections to public parks and wildlife areas so that people can go from where they live on a bike or hike to those areas and enjoy them. And really making those trail connections is getting increasingly difficult to find the land to make the connections. So we use areas along roadways sometimes, but there's not always enough room there either. So lots of reasons why I think we need more land, and I think it was Mike kind of touched on the economics of it. We're trying to educate people in the state, and we'd like to keep them here, right? We don't want young people to be our number one export. We do a good job educating them, then they go out to Colorado or California or wherever it is that they want to be, near the oceans or the mountains or the coast. So we need to have recreational opportunities to keep them here and to attract people here.
All right, very good. And Mark Belcham, let's bring you in here now. For some of the reasons stated, we've as I mentioned, we've heard concerns that maybe Iowa owns too much public land, stated by some. What's your view of that? Does Iowa own enough public land? Is 3% enough to address all those things that folks have already been talking about, or should the state be even more aggressive than it already is?
Well, thanks, Aaron, and thanks for the participants. I know by looking at participant list, we have at least 2 legislators on this conversation, and I enjoy a good working relationship with those folks and appreciate them participating today. I don't think, Aaron, we should be talking about quotas. I think anyone can look at the facts and say that recreation is important to the state, that hunting and fishing, trapping is important to the state for a variety of reasons. Health and wellness, also recruiting, and whether it's the superintendent of a private Christian school in rural Iowa that's trying to recruit teachers, or whether it's the CEO of Fortune 500 companies in one of our bigger cities, folks, the workforce wants recreation, and that happens in open spaces. So to answer your question, I don't think we have enough, but I don't think that's the right question. I think the right question, if I may, is how are we managing our process of acquiring it, managing land, and how are we working with all of the groups that have an interest in this? It's just a fact that there are far more strip malls in Iowa than there are state parks. I don't hear an outcry about that. And so we really need to be looking at this holistically and being fair. And I feel like the General Assembly is asking a lot of very good questions, but we really need to have balance here. I'll just make a plug for hunting and fishing, since that's the interest that I represent. All the small towns in Iowa, I mean, hunting and fishing and trapping isn't going on in Des Moines. It's not going on. Well, sometimes it goes on in the backyards of some of my neighbors, but that's a different subject for a different day. But it happens in rural Iowa, and it happens on land, and most of it happens on private land. But what we're finding is the demand for hunting opportunities, whether it's upland game birds, waterfowl, or deer, that demand is outstripping the ability of folks to be able to hunt. And so maybe that's something that we need to be looking at as well. Maybe the Farm Bureau can be helpful in working with groups like Ducks Unlimited and Pheasants Forever to be able to create a conduit where we can talk to private landowners. But we're concerned that the legislation that has come about not just this past year, but 2017, we've seen it a number of times, isn't really asking the right questions. And I hope to have an opportunity before we finish to talk about grazing and some of the other things that I think get to the heart of the matter.
Well, yeah, go ahead. Let's stick with you, Mark, and keep going. Tell us about that.
So, I mean, and Joe and some of the others can correct me if I'm wrong, but the average corn suitability rating for the land that Iowa owns is in the 30s. So this is not productive land. It tends to be, in many cases, highly erodible land that isn't suitable for growing commodity crops. Well, then the question becomes, okay, well, if we're a cattle farmer, and I know Senator Shipley's on participating today and is a cattle farmer, I would say I'm a cattle hobbyist. We have 850 acres in Lucas and Marion counties, my family. We have a cow-calf operation, if you will. And I know from personal experience that there is a shortage of grazing. One of the things that a number of us, whether it's Joe McGovern and his organization or DU and others, we've been working with the DNR, and I have to give a lot of credit to Director Lyon and her team. Let's make sure that we are maximizing the grazing opportunities on public land that Iowa owns. That gets to the issue of demand, but it also gets to the issue of maintenance. Whether it's goats or whether it's cattle, they have a good way of maintaining the vegetation on the public land. So those are the types of things that I feel like aren't getting enough attention either through the media or through maybe some crosstalk between the various organizations. Some of the conversations are going on around this area, but not enough.
Well, I might add, Aaron, to Mark's point, I think the operative word, though, is maintenance, and whose opinion is that? Many times people will try to compare and contrast. Let's take the state parks, for an example. They have a different set of maintenance needs. They have a different funding source for taking care of those areas, and same true with the County Conservation Board. But if you compare a wildlife area, a natural area, let's say in Kossuth County or in Woodbury County or wherever that is, that's an entirely different perspective on what you might call maintenance. The management of a wildlife area is far different than the maintenance of a park or even a trail. And so I think it's also fair that we don't draw that as one large conclusion that they're not, quote, taking care of what they have. To me, that's not an accurate narrative across the board. Can you find places that need maintenance? Of course, you can find that anywhere. You can find that on any bridge, any road, find that anywhere. But adding wildlife areas, which is the overwhelming number of new public areas in our wildlife areas, those are an entirely different maintenance need. And really, they do a great job with prescribed fire. They do a great job on those things. And I think to Mark's point, there's a new opportunity that grazing can be part of that management. The management of a grassland, let's say a prairie, evolved under grazing. So with prescribed fire and grazing, we see a higher biodiversity. So there are a lot of opportunities that we can benefit and work together with that agricultural community. Under no circumstance is a new wildlife area's purpose anything other than creating a new wildlife area. There's not trying to hurt a producer, a farmer, or a grazer at all. That's a false narrative. But again, when I go back to that tension, when we protect a virgin prairie that's never been plowed, so it's not plowed, maybe there was some other uses that someone would want. So if we can find a way to work together, and I guarantee any conservation group would welcome that, having the dialogue around how do we integrate in good grazing practices on our grasslands, things like that. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Mark.
Yeah, and I think one thing to add to that too, just for an educational purpose, because I'm sure the folks on this phone are probably aware of it, but with the group that's listening, there are opportunities like that are already occurring in the state too. So IHAP property, so IHAP, Iowa Habitat Access Program. If you're not familiar with that, is where landowners voluntarily enter their property or estate, or states can do it, into an access program. It makes them viable for public access. They're still privately owned. I'm not sure of all the benefits on the backside of that for landowners, but there's already opportunities in the state that are being used too. So I don't want folks to take away from this that it's an either or conversation. There's already opportunity that we can continue to improve upon. And I've had some great experiences on those IHAP properties where many times, half of a property will be owned by the farmer that's not an IHAP property, and the other half will be. And you're able to walk up, and if he's out in his yard mowing his yard or whatever the case may be, shake his hand, tell him thanks for letting you recreate there on that property. And they continue to stay in that program. So there's obviously benefit for everybody, and there's opportunities out there to continue to capitalize on. So the wheel doesn't have to be reinvented necessarily either.
Very good. And that also touched on a little bit something that I had wanted to get to, talking about the maintenance of lands. And again, I'm drawing back on my experience of covering that debate during the legislative session. And that was one of the topics. Joe, maybe we'll start with you again on this one again, because you were there. The argument was presented that if we had the DNR here, I'd point this to them instead. But in your view, your experience, Joe, is the state sufficiently maintaining the lands that it already owns?
Yeah, in my opinion, very much so. And especially when you look at, if you were to analyze their budget, I'm not going to quote you numbers, but if you look at their budget over let's say the last 10 or 20 years, you will see a pretty flat budget, status quo budget, if you will. I think they're doing a great job, especially with the resources they're giving. I've been to state parks within the last few days, and I think they're doing a fantastic job. And I see, can we do better? Of course, we can always do better. So I think that answer is yes. And I think it's very important that we always draw the contrast between what are you talking about maintenance? Is it your version of what a natural area should look like? That's fair. But when you're trying to draw a comparison between a state or a county park, which has picnic tables and building infrastructure, and we all know those need maintenance, continual maintenance, compared to a wildlife area that's woodland or prairie. Most of that comes down to invasive species and relatively small amount of what we would call maintenance. So I think that's an important contrast. One of our biggest issues, just to address that, Bill, wasn't that there wasn't a prioritization of maintenance. It was that we didn't want to lose the opportunity to add to our parks, our trails, our wildlife areas in lieu of maintenance. So we viewed that as a potentially either or. And we saw that as kind of the contrast. So our concern was that somehow that was going to turn into that we couldn't provide more outdoor recreational opportunities for Iowans.
Aaron, could I jump in on this?
Please do.
Respectfully, I feel like the maintenance issue is a red herring that is put out there by some folks. And, I liken it to somebody who's starving that is not allowed to buy food, and then you criticize them for being too thin. I mean, in this particular case, if there really is a concern about maintenance, then the General Assembly need to fund it. I happen to think, and I echo what Joe McGovern said, 100%. Director Lyon and her team continually do more with less, year after year. I think our state parks, by and large, are holding their own, despite a lack of, or what Joe mentioned as flatline budgeting. I think the wildlife areas, we touched on that earlier. I do think it's important, just to finish that thought, I think the wildlife areas, by and large, are very well maintained. yeah, we can always do better, but it's a matter of funding. You can't starve the maintenance budget year after year and then criticize lack of maintenance. I think I think that gets us away from the collaboration that the conservation community, and I think a lot of folks in the production agriculture community want to have and do in fact have. Those are my thoughts. I feel very passionate about that argument. I think there's other arguments that can be made about public land that are far more persuasive than that one. I just think that's a red herring.
Well, and Mark and Aaron, I might just add it, and I appreciate that, Mark. Also know that the dollars that are used for acquiring a new wildlife area is a different pot of money than the maintenance funds. Hunters and anglers have long paid their way. I think Mike would agree. All of us that buy hunting licenses, we know how that is. And so when hunters and anglers purchase their licenses and they contribute to the habitat stamp or in the Pittman-Robertson Act, things like that, those are the dollars that are used for new wildlife areas to provide more outdoor recreation. So it's not as simple to say they should maintain what they have before they buy something else. Those are two different pots of money. So it isn't like if you cut off new wildlife areas that somehow there's going to be those dollars for maintenance. So I think we just want to be mindful of how we fund maintenance, especially of our state parks or our county parks, and then how some of these new wildlife areas are acquired.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, Joe. You know, you talk about the Pittman-Robertson or Dingell-Johnson Act, both conservation policy that was put in place many years ago. Those funds are also matching funds that come from a federal pot that, you know, we have matching opportunities from state provided funds as long as they meet certain criteria. So there's back to the idea of different pots. It's not a balance scale. Take it from this one, put it this one. There's, you know, things that are governed at a different level from those funding opportunities that if we don't utilize appropriately, we miss out on everything, whether it be land maintenance, whatever the case may be. So it's making sure that we maximize those opportunities as a state as well.
So I'll jump in here. We manage a lot of land in Linn County, and I think that our taxpayers are getting a really good deal with the staff that we have. We spend our winters doing forestry work, forest stand improvement. In the spring, we're burning prairies to maintain that property. Then we pivot those same people to do campgrounds, to run the campgrounds, to run the trails, to mow the parks, and do all those kinds of things. And then as that season kind of winds down, we're pivoting back to, we burned some prairies in the fall, and we're starting to do tree removal, hazard tree removal, so that the park stays safe. I just think that the people are getting a really good deal by keeping our maintenance staff active, but they're doing different kinds of maintenance different times of the year.
Excellent. Love the discussion. I appreciate everyone. I just wanted to take a quick moment here. We're roughly halfway through, maybe a little bit before, a little bit beyond. But thank again everyone who's joining us today. We hope you're just enjoying the discussion. We've got much more, and wanted to remind folks again, in case you weren't on at the top, that you are able to submit questions too for our panelists if you'd like. And I see one really good one that we'll definitely get to in a little bit here. So we appreciate that. And if anybody else has a question for this group, we welcome that. Put it in the chat. That'll get past us, and we'll get to it if we can. Before I get to that question, one more thing I wanted to make sure we talk about, and one or two folks mentioned this, and Dennis, maybe I'll start with you, Dennis Gumate with the Linn County Conservation, but I'd be curious to hear more perspectives, because I've heard this before about how important this kind of thing is to create opportunities for Iowans, and whether it's through recreation, trails, that kind of thing, or whether it's through, and forgive me, I didn't write down who said the high demand that there is to come to our state to hunt and fish. I'd be curious if you guys could all expand on that, and from your each perspectives, how critical that is to have these lands available to attract and keep Iowans in a state that is struggling to grow its population over the last decade or so. Dennis, you start us out if you don't mind.
Well, I think the Iowa Economic Development Authority has some really good information about that. And one of the quotes that I saw from their leadership was, Iowa really has a population problem in that we can't attract people to the state to fill jobs that we have. We have jobs here that people could be attracted to fill, but we can't attract them. They also did some research on what would entice people to actually come to Iowa. And 3 of the top 6 things had to do with recreation and parks and trails, natural areas, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of information out there that says we can do a better job of attracting people to enjoy the recreational opportunities and the landscapes that we have here. But we don't want to stop. We don't want to stop now.
Yeah, that's good. Anybody else?
Yeah,
Go
go
ahead,
ahead, Joe.
I'll just give you a quick story. I mean, I had a young family, gentleman in his mid-30s had moved from Colorado to Iowa, which I was very fascinated with. And upon investigating a little bit, learned that his wife was from Iowa. So I just asked the obvious question. At the same time, I want to insert, he had a brochure from Minnesota, he had a brochure from Wisconsin, and he was saying, well, I'm planning my vacations. And I just flat out asked him, I said, well, why aren't you planning your vacation in Iowa? And then I asked him the other question, would you have moved to Iowa if your wife wasn't from here? Now, remember, he moved from Colorado, he moved to Iowa. And he said, blank, no. And I kind of laughed, and he said, no, we would have gone somewhere else. And I asked why. And it's like, well, he's appreciated some of the found treasures because Iowa has some fantastic places. But, he was looking for more outdoor recreational opportunities, but he moved here because of family. And I think we see that a lot. I have 3 children that I've raised in Iowa. I want them to consider Iowa as one of their choices because they're very outdoor-minded people. They love outdoor recreation. I'm confident they're going to get a good paying job somewhere, but I want them to consider Iowa as a place. So as a former director of the DNR said, what do people do after work? And are we providing enough opportunities? I want to address the issue, though. It's not like we're looking at, millions of more acres. The lands we're focusing on are connections, watersheds, enhancing our water quality, our soil health. So it's a very competitive process when you look at acquisitions of wildlife areas or new wetlands, and they're very targeted. So I think it's important that we work with the legislature, we work with producers, we work with the ag community, so we prioritize, the most important tracts of land where that use is important, and that we keep our best land in production. I mean, that's a very important part of Iowa, and it always will be. So I think we just really need to pivot from worrying about whether we have too much or too little and start focusing on the what and the how and where and how important that is to enriching people's lives here in Iowa and attracting workforce. So we welcome the dialogue. We welcome the interaction. We want it to be productive. So I would speak for all the conservation community that we really want to work together to figure this out.
Yeah, what I was going to add too is I'm kind of a perfect use case of this too. Of you talk about how do these opportunities help retain or draw people to this state. So I grew up in Indiana, moved to Iowa for work, and that decision was solely based on a financial out of college, eyeball deep in debt. Like, oh, got a job, going to go there. As soon as I moved here, the second thing I thought about is where am I going to deer hunt this fall? At that time, I lived over by Des Moines, Big Creek area, just north of Des Moines there, decent opportunity. So I was like, I at least have a spot to go. through some research and time, I found some other spots to stick around. Now I live on the east side of the state, and there came a time where family was getting a little bit older. Wife was ready to move, and she had said, "Well, hey, we either want to get closer to Indiana or we're going to leave Iowa." So her conversation was, "Let's go out west. All the things we like to do, the outdoors, the areas." And I said, "I'm willing to consider that, but it was the company I work with. I was happy to be with, wanted to get closer to Indiana." So as soon as we said that, I was like, "Well, I'm not going any farther east than the Mississippi." Because of a few things. One, Iowa opportunity around deer hunting, which is a big passion of mine. But the just the overall. But if there wouldn't have been access here, if I would have been sitting here for 7, 8 years at that point, struggling to do the things that I enjoy outdoors, I would have been job be damned. We're going to go somewhere where I can enjoy the things I do outside of work. And especially at that time when I had a young family where, it wasn't the easiest to just go spend an extra $150 to go to the movies and have dinner or something along those lines. It's an opportunity for everybody, regardless of where you sit on the financial scale, to have the same opportunity. And I think that's where it helps with retention and keeping people in the state. And, I now live on the east side of the state, the right side of the Mississippi, in my opinion, and continue to enjoy the opportunities that Iowa has. But I think with that, some other things we've seen in recent years, if you look at, everybody's favorite topic, so I apologize, but COVID, right? I think it comes up and it'll continue to come up for years in conversation. That year, record turkey tags sold in Iowa. We went from about 85 to 87,000 fishing licenses to somewhere in the mid 130s. So that drove a large portion of Iowans to reconnect with the outdoors. I don't know today's numbers, but I can just tell you from both in-state and out-of-state, which I participate in a lot, those numbers are lower than they were in 2020, but they're a lot higher than they were prior to 2020. So now we have more people, and I don't want to say the word competing because it's not a competition, but more people vying for space in the same outdoor spaces that we had before. So I think that just will continue to drive some of the demand for that opportunity.
Hey, Aaron, if I could just jump in on something Mike said. So he was talking about came to Iowa for a job, and people of my age, that was kind of the pattern. We went where the jobs were, and then you kind of find out what you can do in the area. That's not necessarily the pattern anymore. Younger people decide where they want to go based on what they can do when they get there. And realistically, there's lots of jobs where they can work from anywhere they want. So we need to be able to attract them to Iowa because of the things we have to do in that after work time frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would also add, keep in mind, if you're thinking about these hunting areas as one single use, they have all sorts of other stacked benefits. They provide water quality. They provide other outdoor recreation in the non-hunting months, hiking, bird watching. They do a lot of other what you'd call environmental services for Iowa than just hunting. So we always look at the stacked benefits on that acre. Yes, it was purchased as a hunting wildlife area, but look at all the other benefits we get. And so that again is how we want to evaluate these things. Which acre does the most for those dollars?
All right, excellent. I want to get now to a couple of questions that have popped in. And before I do, real quick, I'll maybe just give a heads up to our panelists who, again, appreciate you all being here today. Before we log off here, I'll give everybody one last chance with a closing comment. So if there's anything we haven't covered today that you think was important in the discussion, maybe be thinking about that now for when we come to you for that around the horn. But let's get to our first question, and this is a really good one. Wetland development has been slow in the state despite being called for in the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. And for those who may not be as familiar, that's a strategy that was put forth to deal with pollutants in Iowa waters that are contributing to flowing into the Mississippi River and contributing to issues down in the Gulf of Mexico. Wetlands are typically developed on submarginal lands and have a multitude of benefits from water quality, flood mitigation, and habitat development. So here's the question: what tools do you think are needed to achieve the wetland goals outlined in the nutrient reduction strategy? And I'll open it up to anybody who'd like to take a crack at that one.
I'd like to take a crack at it as the waterfowl person on the panel. The question is so important. Let's start with the nutrient reduction strategy. I think most folks in production agriculture and the conservation community would say, first of all, the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy are thoughtful and important. The strategy, the flexibility of the nutrient reduction strategy is also a great benefit. The nutrient reduction strategy has been wildly successful for the most part in managing phosphorus load, but has equally been woefully inadequate when it comes to nitrogen. These are facts. These aren't conservation's facts versus production agriculture's facts. These are indisputable facts that IDOLs and the DNR and the folks at Iowa State can all verify. So the question is, why is that the case? One of the many strategies within the nutrient reduction strategies calls for tens of thousands, literally tens of thousands of wetlands throughout the state of Iowa. Now, these aren't going to be necessarily crep wetlands everywhere that are, 15 to 30 acres in size. And in a lot of cases, and DU is working with IDOLs on this, and would welcome the Farm Bureau to participate as well, on tile zone wetlands that are small, that tie into the hundreds of thousands of miles of tiling throughout this state that have drained land to make it more productive. We can build smaller wetlands and tie them into the tile zone. So the other thing that needs to happen is we need more cooperation, frankly, from the Army Corps of Engineers. The Rock Island office has effectively made it nearly impossible from a permitting standpoint. And the Rock Island office has a position under WOTUS that is completely inconsistent with science, and more importantly, inconsistent with how their peer corps of engineers operate throughout the country. We're working with Senator Ernst, Senator Grassley, and our congressional delegation. But as most of us on the call know, the Corps is afforded tremendous discretion. So it's not going to be easy, but more funding for the nutrient reduction strategy in the area of wetlands, and more cooperation from the Corps. We can have all the funding we desire, but without the Corps stepping in, it's going to be difficult.
I would say it's funding. I mean, I appreciate everything Mark said, and I agree with a lot of what he said. I think it's funding, and we can't expect a producer, of just farmer, that's their livelihood, to just say, I'm going to take 10 or 20 or 30% of my field out of production. We have to figure out how to compensate them for that, and then find a way forward on that. So if we're looking at restoring a prairie pothole in north central Iowa, where I'm from, that might be a significant amount of acres of that field. So we have to be able to compensate them, and that is funding. I think if we funded the Natural Resource and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund, or IWIL, that could go right towards wetlands. It doesn't have to be public land. We look at lake restoration, we look at wetland restoration. It could easily feed into that and stay on private ownership. It's more important that we restore those wetlands for a water quality and not worry about ownership of those. But that if you look at, let's say, 1,000 a year or 1,000 total, we're not going to get there doing 10, 20 a year. We need to increase the pace of that wetland restoration, and that's going to be funding.
From Linn County Conservation's perspective, we've been adding a lot of wetlands to existing publicly owned property. So we're putting them in our parks, our wildlife areas. And in fact, I have about a 3-acre one right outside of my office window here. It's currently dry, but when we get heavy rains, we're going to store about 5 acre feet of water in those wetlands before it runs into the river. So another benefit of publicly owned land is that we can use it for water quality enhancements. The questioner's right. We need to do a lot more with wetlands, and I agree with Joe. Depending on the figure you see, you want to read, we've lost somewhere between 96 and 98% of Iowa's traditional wetlands, what we would have had historically. And so we got there incrementally. We drained this little wetland, we drained this little wetland, and we're going to get back to some kind of a balance incrementally. But Joe's right, we're going to have to pick up the pace.
All right, very good. Excellent question. Thank you for that. We got one more in there right now, and there's still time. If anybody else has a question, we might be able to get to one more after this. But I'll post this one, and it has to do with dual or multi-use lands. The questioner says there's a push for renewable energy and transmission. Is there a benefit or low risk to sharing land resources, or are these best kept separate? And open that up to anyone who wants to field that one. Did our questioner stump the panel here?
I'd say there's a benefit in looking at it. I think you would need to, we want to be wise on how we use the land. Just because it's a prairie or a grassland and we say, it'd be a perfect place for a solar field, that wouldn't be wise. So I think we should always be open and stacked benefits, but we should also be very clear on what the best use of that is and what the purpose is. So, and that goes for agricultural land too. I mean, we definitely have to be mindful of good quality Iowa land. What's the best use? And that should probably be good quality Iowa farmland. And so we can't just trade one use for another. So hopefully we'll look at that comprehensively as well and be mindful of what the best use is.
Yeah, and the thing I was trying to think and formulate there of the first thing I think of when I hear energy in Iowa, a lot of times I think windmills, right? If anybody's drove down the 80 corridor in the last few years, you can definitely see a difference of that landscape. And to Joe's point, I think it's the definition of what that space is and what it's for. But I think we should also look to history to understand before we jump to something like that. If you look in the Northwest U.S., tremendous amounts of funding going towards dam removal, where, back in the late 20s, early 30s, power generation, dam installation. Now, as they look at that, we're spending a lot of money to pull those dams back out because at the time that was hey, it's a good idea. Let's dual use it. And now they're saying there's more benefit to not be at that rate, and we're remediating those. So again, not that they're not good ideas, but I think we should make sure that all interest and all future interests are considered when we get into conversations like those.
Yeah, from Linn County's conservation's perspective, we've been adding some solar panels in areas that are already impacted. So areas that we mow, tops of buildings, that kind of thing. But I agree with Joe. We'd want to be real cautious about putting either windmills or solar panels out in, a really unique natural area. So there may be some places where it's appropriate.
And back to something we talked about earlier, grazing comes to mind. Again, we talk about dual purpose. It doesn't necessarily have to be energy related. There are other things, whether it's partnering with production agriculture for grazing opportunities on wildlife land, or recreational opportunities. That's, to me, the kind of conversation that we should be looking at. When it comes to energy, if there's a state park that exists or is being contemplated, certainly to the extent the taxpayer can get a better deal through renewable energy, that makes sense. But I think by and large, whether it's wind or solar, we need to be reserving those opportunities for landowners, because it's a tremendous source of income over a prioritization over the state.
All right, and we did get one more question, so we'll take that one real quick, and then I'll wrap it up here and let everybody give their closing thoughts. And this one, as I read it, I'll admit is a little tough, but I read it for a reason, because the question basically asks most of the folks here to answer a question for people who aren't on this panel, but we'll give it our best shot here. The question is, why is there so much resistance to additional public land ownership when many acquisitions are already primarily focused on low productivity land, and there is clearly a demand for more land for hunting, recreating, etc. Again, I'll take this opportunity to let folks know who may have missed it early on that there are some people and some groups that have different perspectives on some of these questions and may have disagreed with some of the things we've been talking about here, and we tried to get those folks involved in this and weren't successful, unfortunately. So I'll just open it up to the folks here as best you can. When you've had this debate or this discussion, what are the most frequent, pushback that you get on this?
I'll be happy to jump in on this. Aaron, you're being very diplomatic. We're talking about the Iowa Farm Bureau. I mean, let's just call it what it is. They are, in my opinion, the single most powerful special interest in the state of Iowa. And they do a lot of good work, by the way. I think folks in the conservation community, certainly ducks and limited values quite a lot of what the Farm Bureau advocates for. They are, as they like to tell people anyway, they are a grassroots organization. They got a lot of nice artwork too out in West Des Moines. But kidding aside, they are representing to the General Assembly a narrative that beginning farmers, for example, can't afford or don't have access to land, and then juxtaposing that towards, well, it's because of public land. Respectfully, that just is not factually the case at all. I mean, we believe in this country, I don't think we've lost sight of it, that, and it's in the Bill of Rights about property. We believe that individuals should have the choice to sell to whomever they want. And the reality is commercial real estate development, particularly in the exurban areas, suburban and exurban areas, to build more tract housing, multifamily housing, to build more strip malls, that consumes orders of magnitude more land and drives up the cost of that land accordingly than any kind of public land. That's just a fact. And so that's what's disappointing about the conversation. I don't see criticism of the Iowa realtors or professional developers of Iowa. I see it directed towards conservation. And I'm not trying to say that it gets back to, again, I believe firmly, farmers should be able to sell the land to whomever the hell they want to sell the land to. And that's the way the system has worked in this country. And the result of that is the marketplace determines the price. They're not making more land in the state of Iowa or anywhere else. So it's certainly not because, I mean, just factually, we're sitting at 3% of public land. I mean, it's really ludicrous to suggest that beginning farmers can't afford land because we have too much public land, or we're using too much public money to acquire new land, so-called bidding up the price. That's just not factually correct.
All right. Well, and I apologize if anyone else wanted to jump in on that, but I want to make sure we give time here. We're our last minute. No, I appreciate the response and the passion. That's why we have these discussions. So we probably got about 30 seconds each. Mike Webb, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say real quick, a lot of conversation in the word land here, but don't forget in this conversation is public waters as well, right? So everybody here has an interest in those, but that's part of this whole conversation as well when it comes to it. And, something that is, don't want to get just swept up in the idea of somewhere you can walk, right? It's resources that people use to boat, fish, swim, etc. And let's say if you're interested in this conversation, just looking at the panel here, right? There's somewhere that you can fit in on a conservation organization, and we're trying to reach across both sides of the aisle to make things happen in the state positive for all Iowans. So if you're interested, look into groups like my BHA that I sit on, Mark, Ducks Unlimited, Dennis with Lynn County, Joe with INHF. If you're interested, there's definitely opportunity out there to get involved.
Very good. Dennis Guillemot, quick roundup here.
Sure. I just encourage people to do what I've been doing the last couple of years after this became a real issue that Iowa supposedly has too much public land. Just do a windshield survey. As you drive around the state, just look out your windshield and look at places that you think would be interesting to go explore, and are they available to you? And how many places do you come across that you could just get out and walk on that's public land? So just do your own windshield survey and then come to your own conclusions.
All right, Joe McGovern. Oh, we're having we'll come back to Joe. Mark Belgium.
I'm unmuted. There we go. I have a
Joe. There's Joe.
I have a honking horn in the background, so if you hear that, it's not
gotcha.
me. So, I appreciate this panel. I think what we need more than anything, my closing, is we just got to get past this. We got to figure out how to work together, work with the legislator, work with the agricultural community. For Iowans, we can do this. We need to get past this kind of false narrative that we have too much or too little and that there's this tension. So I welcome the conversation. We are always willing to come to the table. I think we need to start with the facts and end with the facts and remove some of these false narratives, whichever direction they're coming from. But I feel like we can make Iowa better. We've got to figure this out. I'd love to see the Natural Resource and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund funded this year so we can get busy planning rather than infighting. So thank you, Aaron, for having me, and thank you all for participating.
All right, and finally, Mark Beltram.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks to the panelists and the participants. Fund the trust. I mean, that's my closing comment. Voters in an overwhelming over 60% of the voters in 2010 voted to create a trust, and I don't think they went to the polls to create a trust on paper. They went to the polls knowing full well that the trust is going to be funded by a sales tax increase. The fund has not had a dime put in it because the General Assembly, for a variety of reasons, has been unwilling, and not just Republicans, Democrats too, have been unwilling to raise the sales tax. Polling clearly shows overwhelming support year over year, and polling done by Republican pollsters, I might add. Final thing, production agriculture, they're our partners. This is not an us versus them, to Joe McGovern's point. We have to work together, and the conservation community is willing to do that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you to our panelists, and thank you everybody for joining us. I apologize for taking us a few minutes over. The good news is we're not bumping into another session. We've got a little lunch break planned here. So if you have to skip your dessert, that's Mark Beltram's fault. Send all your emails to him. I joke. We love the discussion. We're very appreciative for it. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you everyone for joining us today. If you haven't, make sure you check out the schedule and all the other panel discussions going on throughout today and tomorrow. As I said, we have a little break for lunch now. The next panel within the policy track is about creative ways to address food scarcity and insecurity. But there are many, many more. So please check them out. Thank you everybody for joining us for Iowa Ideas 2023.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.